I want to start with what the record says this swamp did to the people and the tools that went into it, because the oldest documents about the place read less like a survey and more like a warning. Shovels and chains sank into the peat and were never dug back out. Men ran survey lines into a wall of cane and cypress and came back out having measured almost nothing, and one French traveler who watched the digging wrote flatly that no levels had ever been taken, which meant the people cutting a channel through this ground did not even know for certain which way the water would run. The mud pulled the shoes off a man's feet, and the water carried fever off the same standing pools. And 2 centuries later, in the summer of 2016, 4 trained archaeologists tried to cut a fresh trail toward one of the dry islands, deep inside this swamp, worked at it for 8 full hours with modern blades, advanced 200 feet, and gave up. That is the ground this canal was cut through, and the clearest surviving account of what it did to the human beings who were sent into it comes from a man who was there, an enslaved boatman named Moses Grandy, born on these waters around 1786, who lived long enough to reach freedom and set the whole thing down in writing. And straight through the eastern edge of that ground, between 1793 and 1805, someone cut a canal, 22 miles of open water, wide enough and deep enough to float loaded boats out of Virginia and down into North Carolina, dug through peat and root and standing water. They did it with shovels and picks and axes, because in those years there was simply no machine on earth that could dig a canal, and there would not be for another lifetime. Every single yard of it was opened by human muscle, by people standing in the mud the record had warned about, moving the swamp one spadeful at a time, for 12 years. Grandy is one of the very few people this story left us a name for, and I want you to hold on to him for exactly that reason. He was born into slavery in Camden County, North Carolina, and he grew up on these waters, and he is where this story keeps a face. The men who actually dug the channel, gang after gang of them, are where it does not. That gap, between the one name we have and the hundreds we lost, is the thing I keep circling back to. So let me set the 2 sides of that gap next to each other, because the whole story lives in the space between them. On one side is Grandy, the man the record happened to keep, because he reached freedom and told his story to someone who wrote it down. On the other side are the digging gangs, enslaved men hired out to the canal company by the season, rented from the plantations around the swamp like tools, and set to work in the wettest and most dangerous ground in the region. The company's books recorded the canal. They recorded the miles cut and the money spent and the men paid. And the men who were paid were the owners, not the workers. The people actually standing in the water do not come down to us as names. They come down as a labor cost. And here is the fact that stops me every time I read it. Because that workforce was rented and enslaved, and no one thought their lives worth recording, there are no known records of the deaths that happened while this canal was being dug. A 12-year project in fever country, and the count of who died in it is simply blank. The ditch survived. The names did not. Let me show you the ground itself, because you cannot understand the labor until you understand what it was fighting. The Great Dismal Swamp once covered something more than 1 million acres, straddling the line between southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, a vast flat sponge of peat and black water grown thick with Atlantic white cedar, which the people there called juniper, and with bald cypress and black gum. At its heart lies Lake Drummond, a shallow lake stained the color of strong tea by the tannin that leaches out of all that steeping cedar and cypress, and it sits oddly high, near the center and near the top of the whole swamp, so that water tends to seep outward from the middle rather than drain away to the edges. The soil is not soil in the way a farmer would know it. It is peat, deep beds of half-rotted plant matter, soft and wet and in places many feet thick, ground that will not hold a road, will not hold a building, and in the old accounts would barely hold a standing man. Sink a post into it, and the post keeps going. Drop a tool, and the tool is gone. This was not a forest with some water in it. It was water with a forest standing in it, and for most of its history it turned away nearly everyone who was not desperate enough or forced to enter it. And yet from the very beginning, wealthy and well-connected men looked at that 1 million acres of drowned cedar and saw money waiting to be drained out of it. That is where the first great effort in this story begins, and it belongs to a name you already know. In 1763, the colonial government of Virginia granted 40,000 acres of the swamp to a group of investors who called themselves, with no irony at all, the Adventurers for Draining the Dismal Swamp. Among the founders was a young George Washington, along with his brother John Augustine Washington, and a roster of the most connected men in the colony. Their plan was straightforward and, for the time, entirely ordinary. They would drain the swamp, cut the timber, and turn the black peat underneath into farmland, and the labor to do it would be enslaved. At a shareholders' meeting in Williamsburg late in 1763, the company set down in plain writing what the work would take. The task of draining and improving and saving the land, the document said, could not be done with less than 50 able enslaved men, and each partner was expected to supply his share of them. In the summer of 1764, 54 enslaved people, men, women, and children, were brought to a tract on the swamp's western edge that the company called Dismal Plantation, and there they were set to the first hand-cutting of this swamp, felling the cedar, hauling the logs, and digging the long, straight drainage ditches that were meant to pull the water off the land. One of those ditches ran from the western edge of the swamp all the way to Lake Drummond at its center, the first cut ever driven clean through to the lake, and people still call it the Washington Ditch today. You can walk it. It runs arrow straight into the trees, dug by enslaved hands more than 250 years ago, and it is one of the oldest things in the whole swamp that a person made. The drainage dream mostly failed. The swamp was too big and too wet, and the peat did not dry into the rich farmland the investors had imagined. But the ditches taught a lesson that outlasted the dream, and it was a simple one. You could, if you were willing to spend enough human labor, cut a straight, permanent channel through this impossible ground. The drainage companies had proven the tool. What came next would use that same tool, enslaved hand labor cutting a channel through peat, for something far more ambitious than draining a few thousand acres. It would try to cut all the way across the swamp and out the other side. If you appreciate the depth of these American industrial heritage stories and want to support more of them, join at the Boss tier for early access and members-only polls, or Final Boss for member shoutouts and members-only videos. Link below. The idea was a shortcut. The swamp sat squarely between the Chesapeake Bay to the north, in Virginia, and the Albemarle Sound to the south, in North Carolina. Ships moving goods between the two had to go the long and dangerous way around, out into the open Atlantic, and past Cape Hatteras, one of the deadliest stretches of coast on the continent. But if you could connect the rivers on either side of the swamp, a boat could pass from Virginia to North Carolina entirely inland, through protected water, and never risk the ocean at all. The man who pushed hardest for it was a North Carolina political figure named Hugh Williamson, who understood the trade value of an inland connection and argued for it for years. Virginia chartered a private company to build the canal in 1787, and North Carolina agreed 3 years later, in 1790. The two states and the company together would fund a channel straight across the eastern edge of the swamp. On paper, the plan was clean. A canal 22 miles long, running from Deep Creek in Virginia, near Norfolk, down to South Mills in North Carolina, connecting the waters of the Elizabeth River to the Pasquotank. It was to be about 32 feet wide and 8 feet deep, with a set of locks, 7 of them in the end, to carry boats up to the swamp's higher central level and back down the other side. And to save time, the company decided to dig it from both ends at once, one crew starting in Virginia and cutting south, another starting in North Carolina and cutting north. The two of them aimed at each other across the full width of the worst ground in the region, meant to meet somewhere in the middle. That is a confident plan to draw on a map in an office. Out in the swamp, it ran straight into the peat, because the actual digging is where the paper plan and the real ground collided, and the ground won far more often than anyone had budgeted for. Work began in 1793. The men sent to do it were enslaved, hired out to the canal company by the plantation owners who claimed them, and what they walked into each morning is hard to overstate. To cut the channel, they first had to clear the surface, hacking through cane and root and the dense tangle of juniper, and then they had to dig, standing in the peat and the black water, cutting the ditch downward with hand tools while the swamp tried to fill it back in behind them. In the summer, the heat and the insects were merciless, and the fever came off the water. In the winter, the same standing water turned to ice and cold. Progress was measured not in miles, but in feet. By one account preserved in the record, the crews extended the cut by about 30 feet on a good day. 30 feet, across the whole length of that canal, dug from both ends, one shovelful of drowned peat at a time. And the engineering guiding all that labor was, by the honest admission of the people who saw it, crude. Remember that French traveler who wrote that no levels had been taken? That is not a small complaint. Cutting a canal correctly means knowing your grade, knowing exactly how the ground rises and falls so the water sits where you want it. And the record suggests the builders were working largely by eye and by guess, through ground where a proper survey was nearly impossible anyway. They knew the swamp bulged higher in the middle, so they planned locks, 7 of them in all, to lift a loaded boat up to that higher central level and lower it down the far side, like a set of water stairs cut into the peat. And they were doing all of this while 2 separate crews cut toward each other from opposite ends of the cut, miles apart, each one trusting that the line it was digging would meet the other somewhere in the trees. There is something almost unbelievable in that. 2 gangs of enslaved men, working by hand, through a swamp that swallowed instruments, aimed at a meeting point neither of them could see. I said the men who dug it are mostly nameless, but I do not want to leave the work itself as an abstraction, because one witness did write it down, and his name is the one I asked you to hold on to. Grandy grew up enslaved in exactly this world, on the Pasquotank and around this canal, and in his narrative he described what the canal laborers endured, because he watched it and lived near it. The diggers, he said, worked up to the middle, or much deeper, in mud and water, and when the day was done they were given no bedding, and lay down at night in the mud that had dried onto them beside a fire. In the morning, he wrote, men were flogged before work even began, punished simply because they had not managed to finish the previous day's assigned task in ground that made finishing it nearly impossible. He described the biting yellow flies and the mosquitoes settling on a freshly beaten and bleeding back. He recorded one overseer, a man named Macpherson, who he said kept 500 to 700 people at this labor. This is not legend, and it is not me guessing at the conditions. It is a man who was there, telling you plainly, so that you would know. Now I want to show you the one piece of real engineering cleverness in this whole brutal project, because it is genuinely elegant, and it solves a problem you might not have thought to ask about. Here is the question. If you cut a long canal clear through a swamp, what keeps water in it? A canal is useless if it runs dry, and a canal that climbs over higher ground in the middle, the way this one did, is in real danger of doing exactly that at its highest point, its summit. The builders needed a reliable source of water sitting up high, ready to feed the top of the canal and keep it full. And it turned out the swamp itself had already put one there. Lake Drummond, that strange high lake near the center of the swamp, sat above the level of the canal's summit. So the company cut one more ditch, a feeder, running about 3 miles from Lake Drummond to the top of the canal, and let the lake pour its own water downhill into the channel to keep it full. That feeder ditch was finished in 1812, and it is the quiet key to the entire thing. The same swamp that swallowed the tools and drowned the labor also held, at its very center, the reservoir that made the finished canal work. The builders did not fight that part of the swamp. They tapped it. And there is another whole layer of human life in this swamp that the canal ran right past, and it changes how you see the entire place. To understand it, you have to know what else enslaved people were doing in the Dismal, beyond digging the canal. For generations, the swamp's great value was its cedar and cypress, and enslaved men were sent deep into it to cut that timber and split it into shingles, the juniper shingles that roofed a huge swath of the coastal South. The Atlantic white cedar was prized precisely because it resisted rot, the same quality that let it stand for centuries in standing water, which made a juniper roof last where an ordinary one would fail. Getting those shingles out of the swamp was skilled, solitary work, done far out in the wet timber away from any overseer's eye, and it ran on what was called the task system. A man was given a quota, a number of shingles he owed, and if he produced more than his task, he could sometimes earn a little money or goods for the overwork. What that meant, in practice, is that some enslaved shingle-getters lived for much of the year deep in the swamp in a kind of rough half-independence, out of sight, feeding themselves off the land, answerable to a quota rather than a lash from hour to hour. And that half-independent world at the swamp's working edge shaded into something more remarkable still, deeper in, because the same qualities that made this swamp murder to dig a canal through, the tangle, the water, the miles of ground that gave way under a man's boots, made it one of the best hiding places on the entire continent. And people hid in it for lifetimes, and across whole generations. These were the maroons, self-emancipated people who fled slavery and did not run north but instead ran into the swamp, onto the high dry islands buried deep in the interior, and built lives there beyond the reach of any owner. And the two worlds touched. The record shows that enslaved shingle-getters and the maroons deeper in the swamp forged a quiet, informal economy, the shingle-getters subcontracting some of their own task out to the hidden communities and paying them in the goods and money they earned. The canal company's laborers, the shingle camps, and the free maroon settlements were all in the same swamp at the same time, and the same water hid all of them from the outside world. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next video. We publish new videos every week. For a long time this was treated as legend, a story too large to be literally true. Then an archaeologist named Dan Sayers went looking. Starting in 2002, in a project centered at American University and working with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, Sayers began surveying and then excavating the interior islands, and what he found confirmed the old stories. On the high dry ground deep in the swamp, he found the footprints of real, stable, long-lived communities, the traces of cabins and work areas and tools, evidence of people who had lived out there, on their own, for generations. He found very few objects, because people with almost nothing leave almost nothing, and he found no human remains at all, because the acid swamp water dissolves bone. But the pattern was unmistakable. Sites so remote that, as we saw, a modern team with modern blades could barely reach them, had held families who emancipated themselves and stayed free in the one place the outside world could not follow. As Sayers put it, no overseer was going to whip anyone out here. They were free, because they had freed themselves. And think about what that freedom was built on, because it was built on the very thing that made the canal such a nightmare to dig. The miles of boggy, trembling ground that swallowed a survey chain and turned back a modern archaeology team were, to the maroons, a wall. No slave patrol was going to ride a horse across peat this soft. The same water that carried fever into the digging gangs carried protection to the people hiding on the islands beyond them. They built their cabins from the cedar and the cane the swamp handed them. They hunted and grew what food they could on the high ground, and some of them, by the evidence, lived their entire lives in there. Sayers has made the striking point that a person could have been born on one of those interior islands, grown up, grown old, and died, without ever once setting foot in the world of plantations and owners just a few miles away. The country simply found this ground too miserable to follow them into, and so they stayed free in it, generation after generation. The historian Sylviane Diouf gathered the wider written record of these communities, and the estimates that come out of the sources are genuinely startling. Contemporary observers and later historians put the swamp's hidden population in the many hundreds, and by some counts into the thousands, living there across the better part of 2 centuries, from the early 1700s until the Civil War finally made the hiding unnecessary. And a few of them, just a few, come down to us as more than a number, because an outsider happened to record them. In September of 1856, a magazine artist named David Hunter Strother, who wrote under the pen name Port Crayon, published an account of the swamp in a national magazine, and with it, an engraving of a maroon he had encountered deep in the Dismal, an older man he called Osman, crouched and watchful with a gun across his knee. Strother wrote that the man's face was of mingled fear and ferocity. That single image is believed to be the only portrait of an American maroon ever published in a national magazine of the era. Earlier still, back in 1769, a Virginia enslaver named John Mayo placed a newspaper advertisement seeking an enslaved man named Tom, who, the notice said, was supposed to be somewhere about the Dismal Swamp. A runaway advertisement is a cruel kind of document, but read the other way, it is also a receipt. It is the enslaver himself admitting, in print, that a man had gotten into the swamp and could not be found. So hold the whole picture in your mind at once, because this is the strange heart of the place. In the same swamp, in the same years, enslaved men were being worked to exhaustion, digging a canal through the peat. Other enslaved men were living half-free in the cedar-cutting shingles, and free maroon families were raising children on islands the owners could not reach. The canal was slavery, cutting a road through the swamp. The maroon islands were freedom hiding inside it. Both were true at the same time, a few miles apart, in the same black water. And Grandy lived astride all of it, which is why his is the name I keep returning to. Grandy did not spend his life digging. His skill was on the water. He became a boatman and then a captain, running freight boats up and down this very canal and the twisting Pasquotank River beyond it. He was good at it, trusted with valuable cargo, and by his own account, he came to command up to 4 boats. He worked them on shares with the man who owned them, a Mr. Grice, splitting the freight money. And his skill mattered most at the worst possible moment. During the War of 1812, when the British Navy blockaded the Chesapeake Bay and closed the ocean route entirely, this inland canal and the Pasquotank became the only navigable path between Elizabeth City in North Carolina and Norfolk in Virginia. The shortcut through the swamp, cut by enslaved hands, became for a time the only way through at all, and an enslaved captain named Grandy was one of the men keeping the goods moving on it. And Grandy did something with that skill that almost no one in his position ever got the chance to do. He earned money on the water, over years, and he used it to try to buy himself out of slavery. And getting there was brutally, almost unbelievably hard. He saved and he paid for his own freedom, handed over the full sum he had agreed to, and was cheated of it. The money taken and the freedom withheld, so that he had to begin again and raise the price of himself a second time. By the end, he had been made to purchase his own body more than once before the sale finally held, with the help of a sympathetic ship captain named Minner. Read his account of it, and the thing that stays with you is how little bitterness is in it. Mostly it reads as plain, patient endurance, a man who kept working the water until the thing was finally done. And late in his life, unable to read or write himself, he sat down with an abolitionist named George Thompson and dictated his story, and it was published in 1843 as the narrative of the life of Moses Grandy. The proceeds went toward buying the freedom of members of his own family who were still enslaved. That book is the reason we can stand here today and describe what the canal diggers endured in the words of someone who was actually there. One man reached freedom, learned to tell the story, and in the telling, gave a voice back to the hundreds who never got to. So what became of all of it? The canal itself, against every reasonable expectation, got finished. The 2 crews digging from opposite ends met. The channel was opened for through traffic in 1805, and the feeder from Lake Drummond in 1812 finally gave it a dependable supply of water. It was never a perfect canal. It was too shallow at first for the largest boats, the engineering had been crude, and it never quite carried the traffic its investors had dreamed of. There is a hard irony sitting in that. The men who put up the money for this canal were chasing a fortune, and it never really made them one. The human cost of building it was enormous, and the financial return those investors cared about stayed modest for a very long time. They had bet everything on the profit, and the lasting thing they actually left behind was the ditch, which outlived every one of them. But it worked. Boats loaded with shingles and cedar and lumber, with tobacco and cotton and grain, and with barrels of North Carolina turpentine, moved through the swamp on water that had been cut by hand, and it simply never stopped. That same channel widened and deepened over the centuries, but following the same line those enslaved crews dug, is still open and still carrying boats today. It is the oldest continually operating artificial waterway in the United States, now part of the Atlantic Intracoastal Waterway, the protected inland route that runs down almost the entire eastern seaboard. When a pleasure boat idles through the Dismal Swamp Canal on a quiet morning now, it is floating on the single oldest working piece of American canal engineering there is, and almost no one aboard knows whose hands made it. And there is one more thing the water of this swamp did in those same years, quietly, that I cannot leave out. The Dismal became one of the only known water-based refuges on the Underground Railroad. Freedom seekers moving toward free soil used the cover of the swamp and its channels, hiding in it and slipping through it by boat on their way north. So the same drowned corridor that enslaved men had been forced to cut and clear by hand also, in time, helped carry other people out of slavery altogether. The peat did not choose what it carried. It carried the diggers who were forced to cut it, and in time it carried people slipping north toward their freedom, sometimes along the very same dark water. The swamp, meanwhile, mostly lost. The drainage that Washington's company only dreamed of, later generations largely achieved, ditch by ditch and season by season, until the Great Million-Acre Swamp was cut down to a fraction of itself. Today, the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge protects roughly 112,000 acres of it, something close to a tenth of what once stood there, with Lake Drummond still dark at its center. The rest was drained and cleared and farmed and built over, and the endless cedar that roofed the south was cut out of it long ago. The swamp that was too big and too deadly to conquer was, in the end, quietly worn down. And here is where I want to leave you, with the thing I find almost impossible to hold and just as impossible to put down. This one swamp produced two very different monuments at the same time. One is the canal, a genuine feat of pre-machine engineering. 22 miles of working waterway cut through ground so bad that a trained modern crew with power tools could barely cut a path across it, and it is still carrying boats today. The other is the swamp interior itself, where families made themselves free and stayed free for generations in the one place the country could not follow them, ground that now holds the largest collection of maroon archaeology anywhere in America. The same black water carried both. It carried the enslaved diggers whose deaths no one bothered to count, and it carried the free maroon children whose names no one ever learned either, hidden on purpose this time, for their own protection. What the written record kept of any of them is thin almost past believing. A few miles and a few dollars in a company book, one runaway advertisement, a single magazine engraving, and one man's dictated narrative. And I think the honest thing, standing in the middle of it, is that the canal and the hiding place are one history seen from two sides, and that the country still owes the people who cut that water, and the people who vanished into it, the same simple thing it never gave them while they lived: to be named and to be remembered. Before we close, if this kind of pre-modern engineering story is what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos, plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end.